It was a quiet summer evening in Maplewood, a small suburban town known for its picturesque streets and friendly neighbors. The year was 2019, and the town was just beginning to enjoy the warm evenings that seemed to stretch endlessly. At the heart of the story was Jessica Hayes, a 34-year-old event planner who had built a successful career organizing high-end weddings and corporate galas. Jessica was known for her keen eye for detail and her ability to manage chaos with grace. But her personal life was a far cry from the polished events she curated. Jessica's husband, Mark Hayes, was a software engineer whose love for coding and technology was matched only by his devotion to their family. Mark was the kind of man who could fix a broken faucet, help their 8-year-old daughter, Lily, with her math homework, and still find time to plan a family movie night. From the outside, their life looked picture-perfect. A beautiful home, a charming daughter, and a seemingly unshakable marriage. But like many suburban fairy tales, cracks were hidden just below the surface. Jessica's best friend, Monica, had been her confidant since college. The two shared everything from career highs to relationship lows. Monica often joked about how Jessica and Mark's marriage set an impossible standard, but Jessica would just smile and brush it off, keeping her growing doubts about their relationship to herself. The story began on a Friday evening. Jessica had just returned home from a long day of coordinating a high-profile corporate event. She entered the house, kicking off her heels, and called out to her family. Mark was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta, while Lily was sprawled on the living room rug with her crayons and a nearly completed drawing of a treehouse. "Hey, you're home," Mark said, turning to her with a warm smile. "Dinner's almost ready." Jessica leaned against the counter, watching him for a moment. She loved these small domestic scenes, yet recently, they felt like something she was observing rather than living. She shook the thought away, kissed Mark on the cheek, and went to check on Lily. Later that night, after Lily was tucked in and the house was quiet, Jessica sat on the edge of their bed scrolling through her phone. Mark was beside her, immersed in a tech blog. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mark, do you ever feel like we're just going through the motions?" Mark looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Jessica sighed, putting her phone down. "I don't know. Sometimes it feels like we're roommates more than anything else." Mark frowned, clearly caught off guard. "I thought we were doing okay. Is something bothering you?" Jessica wanted to explain the loneliness she'd been feeling, but instead, she shook her head. "Forget it. I'm just tired. It's been a long week." Mark seemed to accept this, though his expression showed he wasn't entirely convinced. He turned off the bedside lamp, and they both lay in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The next morning, Jessica was out early for a meeting with a new client. She met with Daniel Porter, a charismatic entrepreneur who was planning a massive product launch. Daniel was tall, confident, and had a smile that could light up a room. He was also known for his charm, a fact that Jessica had been warned about by her colleagues. The meeting went smoothly. Daniel was engaging, throwing out ideas and jokes that made the room feel alive. Jessica found herself laughing more than she had in weeks, and for the first time in a long time, she felt genuinely seen. "You're amazing at this," Daniel said as they wrapped up the meeting. "I can see why everyone recommends you." Jessica blushed slightly, brushing off the compliment. "Just doing my job." But as she drove home that afternoon, Daniel's words lingered in her mind. It wasn't just the compliment. It was the way he said it, like she was the only person in the room. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. She was married, and whatever excitement she felt talking to Daniel didn't mean anything. Or so she told herself. That evening, as she sat with Mark and Lily during dinner, Jessica found herself distracted. Mark noticed. "You seem quiet tonight," he said, his tone gentle. Jessica looked up, startled. "Sorry, just thinking about work. It's been a hectic day." Mark nodded but didn't press further. He was used to Jessica's work taking up a lot of her energy, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was on her mind. Over the next few weeks, Jessica's interactions with Daniel became more frequent. Between planning sessions and follow-ups, they exchanged texts and calls that often veered beyond professional topics. Daniel had a way of making Jessica laugh, and she found herself looking forward to their conversations more than she cared to admit. Meanwhile, at home, the distance between Jessica and Mark grew. Mark tried to connect, suggesting a weekend getaway or even just a date night, but Jessica always seemed too busy or too tired. He chalked it up to her demanding job, though a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that something was wrong. One evening, as Jessica sat in her car outside the house after a long day, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. "You're incredible. Just thought you should know." Jessica stared at the message, her heart racing. She knew she should ignore it, but instead, she found herself smiling as she typed back, "Thanks. You're not so bad yourself." She turned off the engine, composing herself before walking inside. As she stepped through the door, Mark greeted her with his usual warmth, but Jessica felt a pang of guilt. She told herself it was just harmless banter with Daniel, nothing to feel bad about. But deep down, she knew the line between harmless and something more had already started to blur. Jessica couldn't ignore the pull anymore. What started as harmless texting had spiraled into something she wasn't ready to name. Her exchanges with Daniel had become more frequent, and his charm was impossible to resist. He always seemed to know just what to say to make her feel special, appreciated, even admired, feelings she hadn't experienced in her marriage for what felt like years. At home, Mark was starting to notice the shift. Jessica was more distracted than ever, glued to her phone, and increasingly distant. On a rare evening when they managed to sit down for a family dinner, Mark asked, "Jess, is everything okay? You've been pretty preoccupied lately." Jessica's head snapped up, startled. "What? Yeah, everything's fine. Just work, you know how it is." Mark nodded slowly, but his concern was evident. "If you're feeling overwhelmed, maybe you could take a step back. I mean, you're always working late, taking calls. I miss you." The sincerity in his voice made Jessica's chest tighten with guilt, but instead of addressing it, she forced a smile and nodded. "I'll try. Thanks for understanding." But she didn't change. If anything, the late nights and secretive texts intensified. Jessica convinced herself that she wasn't doing anything wrong. It wasn't like she was physically cheating. Daniel was just someone who made her feel alive in ways Mark couldn't anymore. One Thursday evening, Jessica was working late in her home office when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "Thinking of you. Can't wait for our next meeting. Maybe we could grab a coffee after." Her stomach flipped. The thrill of his attention was intoxicating. She hesitated for only a moment before replying, "I'd like that." The next day, Jessica found herself nervously glancing in the mirror before leaving for her meeting. She chose a dress she hadn't worn in years, one that Mark used to compliment her on when they were newly married. Her heart pounded as she arrived at the coffee shop where Daniel was waiting. He stood as she walked in, flashing that charismatic smile that made her feel like the only woman in the world. "You look stunning," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Jessica felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thanks. I don't usually have time for coffee breaks, but this seemed important." They chatted about work, their lives, and even touched on personal dreams. Jessica was surprised at how easy it was to open up to him. For the first time in a long while, she felt heard, seen, and valued. As they parted ways, Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice low. "You deserve to be happy, Jessica. Don't forget that." Those words lingered with her long after she returned home. But when she walked through the door and saw Mark helping Lily with her school project, the contrast between the life she had and the life she was imagining hit her like a tidal wave. She felt trapped between two worlds, one safe and familiar, the other exciting and full of possibility. The cracks in her marriage deepened over the next few weeks. Jessica became more secretive, taking calls in another room and inventing excuses for late-night meetings that didn't exist. Mark, who had always trusted her implicitly, couldn't ignore the signs anymore. One evening, after Jessica had left for yet another supposed work event, Mark decided to check her laptop, something he had never done before. He wasn't proud of it, but his gut told him something wasn't right. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Messages between Jessica and someone named Daniel. Flirty, intimate conversations that left no doubt about the emotional affair unfolding. When Jessica returned home that night, Mark was waiting for her in the living room. His expression was a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Who's Daniel?" he asked, his voice calm but trembling. Jessica froze, her coat halfway off. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Mark said, standing. "I saw the messages, Jess. I've been suspicious for weeks, but I didn't want to believe it. Now I can't ignore it." Jessica's mind raced. She wanted to deny it, to spin a story that might explain everything away, but the look on Mark's face told her it was useless. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think. We've just been talking." Mark shook his head, his disappointment palpable. "Talking? You call this just talking? Jess, this is betrayal. Maybe it's not physical, but it's still a betrayal." Jessica's defenses went up. "You don't understand, Mark. I've been feeling invisible for years. You're always working, always focused on something else. I needed someone who actually cared about me." Mark's voice rose, something it rarely did. "And you didn't think to talk to me about it? To tell me how you were feeling before turning to someone else?" The argument escalated, raw emotions spilling out on both sides. By the end of it, Jessica was in tears, and Mark was left reeling. For the first time in their marriage, the foundation they had built their lives on felt irreparably fractured. Jessica slept in the guest room that night, her mind a whirlwind of guilt, anger, and confusion. The next morning, Mark barely spoke to her as they got Lily ready for school. The tension in the house was unbearable, and Jessica couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end. In the days that followed, Mark kept his distance, immersing himself in work and avoiding any serious conversations. Jessica, torn between repairing her marriage and pursuing the thrill she felt with Daniel, found herself paralyzed, unable to make a choice. Meanwhile, Daniel's texts became more persistent. He sensed Jessica pulling back and wasn't willing to let her go so easily. One evening, he sent her a message. "You deserve better than this. Let me take you out just for one night. No strings attached." Jessica stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She knew that responding would only deepen the rift between her and Mark, but the allure of Daniel's attention was too strong. Against her better judgment, she replied, "When and where?" As Jessica stepped out of the house that evening, Mark watched her from the window, his expression a mixture of sadness and resignation. He didn't know where she was going, but he didn't need to. Deep down, he already knew. Before we dive deeper into this unfolding drama, remember to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in Mark's shoes? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of the story. Jessica met Daniel at a rooftop bar downtown, a place she'd never been before but instantly loved. The city lights sparkled around them as they sipped wine and talked like old friends. For a few hours, she forgot about the guilt and the pain back home. With Daniel, everything felt easy, exciting, and new. But as the night wore on, reality began to creep back in. When Daniel reached across the table to take her hand, Jessica hesitated. She thought about Mark, about Lily, about the life she was risking for a man she barely knew. "Jessica," Daniel said, his voice soft, "you don't have to live like this. You deserve to be happy." His words struck a chord, but they also filled her with unease. Could she really throw away everything she had built with Mark for the possibility of something new? Or was she chasing a fantasy that would ultimately leave her more broken than before? Jessica's internal conflict only deepened as she drove home that night. She felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her, threatening to crush her under the enormity of it all. When she walked through the door, the house was dark and quiet. She found Mark asleep on the couch, an empty glass of whiskey on the table beside him. For the first time in weeks, she saw him not as a neglectful husband, but as a man who was deeply hurt and struggling to hold their family together. Jessica stood there for a long moment, torn between waking him to apologize and retreating to the guest room to avoid another confrontation. In the end, she chose the latter, but sleep didn't come easily that night. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path she chose would change her life forever. Jessica woke up to the sound of Mark moving around in the kitchen. It was early, too early for Lily to be up, which meant Mark hadn't slept well. She sat on the edge of the guest room bed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their marriage was teetering on the brink. As she made her way downstairs, she rehearsed what she might say. Would she apologize, admit her mistakes, or try to justify the choices that had brought them to this point? But when she entered the kitchen, the sight of Mark standing at the counter, staring blankly into his coffee mug, made her stop in her tracks. Mark turned to her, his expression weary but resolved. "We need to talk." Jessica nodded, her throat dry. "I know." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Mark was the first to speak. "I found out about Daniel weeks ago," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I wanted to believe it was just a phase, that we could work through it, but last night, I don't know anymore." Jessica felt the sting of his words but forced herself to meet his gaze. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mark." Mark's jaw tightened. "But you did. And not just me. You've hurt Lily, even if she doesn't know it yet. Our family is falling apart because you felt—" "What? Unseen? Underappreciated?" Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. "It wasn't just that. I felt like we lost each other, like we were just going through the motions. And Daniel, he made me feel alive again." Mark's expression hardened. "So, instead of talking to me, you went to him? Do you know how humiliating that is, Jessica? To know my wife turned to someone else because I wasn't enough." Jessica broke down, the weight of her guilt overwhelming her. "I'm sorry, Mark. I really am. I don't know how to fix this." Mark leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping. "Maybe you can't." The days that followed were strained, to say the least. Jessica and Mark avoided each other as much as possible, communicating only when necessary and putting on a brave face for Lily. Jessica's conversations with Daniel became less frequent, her guilt making it harder to respond to his messages. She knew she needed to make a choice, but the fear of losing everything kept her paralyzed. Meanwhile, Mark was wrestling with his own turmoil. He wanted to save their marriage, but the betrayal was a wound that refused to heal. One evening, after putting Lily to bed, he reached out to his old college friend, Tom, who had gone through a divorce a few years earlier. "I don't know what to do, man," Mark admitted. "Part of me wants to fight for her, for us, but the other part, I don't know if I can ever trust her again." Tom was quiet for a moment before responding. "Trust is hard to rebuild, but it's not impossible. The question is, do you think she's willing to do the work? And more importantly, do you think you can forgive her?" Mark didn't have an answer, and that uncertainty haunted him. Jessica's breaking point came one afternoon when Lily asked a question that cut straight to her heart. "Mommy, why don't you and Daddy laugh anymore?" Jessica froze, the innocent question forcing her to confront the reality of what her actions had done to their family. She hugged Lily tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'll do better. I promise." That evening, Jessica sat down with Mark and laid everything on the table. She confessed the full extent of her emotional affair with Daniel and acknowledged the damage it had caused. "I know I've hurt you, Mark, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try. I want to fix this." Mark listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he sighed deeply. "I don't know if we can fix this, Jess, but if we're going to try, you need to cut all ties with Daniel." "Completely." Jessica nodded, though the thought of ending things with Daniel filled her with dread. But she knew Mark was right. If she had any hope of salvaging their marriage, Daniel had to go. The next day, Jessica met Daniel in person to tell him it was over. They sat in a secluded corner of the same coffee shop where they'd first met outside of work. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "So this is it?" he said. "You're just walking away?" Jessica nodded, her hands clasped tightly around her coffee cup. "I have to, Daniel. I can't keep doing this. It's not fair to Mark, to Lily, or even to you." Daniel's jaw tightened. And what about you, Jessica? Don't you deserve to be happy? Jessica's heart ached at his words, but she shook her head. I made vows, Daniel, and I need to honor them. I've already caused enough pain. Daniel stared at her for a long moment before nodding. I hope he knows how lucky he is. If he doesn't, you know where to find me. Jessica left the coffee shop feeling a mix of relief and sadness. She had taken the first step toward repairing her marriage, but the road ahead was far from clear. Mark noticed the change almost immediately. Jessica was more present, more attentive, and visibly trying to rebuild their connection. They started attending couples therapy, where they began to unpack the years of resentment and unspoken feelings that had driven them apart. But the process was anything but smooth. Therapy sessions often ended in tears or arguments, and there were moments when both Mark and Jessica questioned whether they were fighting a losing battle. One evening, after a particularly heated session, Mark sat alone in the living room, staring at an old photo of their family. It was from a vacation they'd taken to the beach when Lily was just a toddler. They all looked so happy, so carefree. Mark couldn't help but wonder if they could ever get back to that place. Jessica joined him, sitting quietly beside him on the couch. I miss us, she said softly. Mark glanced at her, his expression weary but sincere. So do I. But I don't know if we can ever be the same. Jessica nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Maybe we can't, but maybe we can be something new, something better. For the first time in weeks, Mark allowed himself to hope. As the days passed, the tension between Jessica and Mark didn't disappear, but there was a noticeable shift. They had both committed to trying, though the weight of Jessica's betrayal and Mark's lingering distrust loomed like a storm cloud over their efforts. Each therapy session was an emotional gauntlet, dredging up years of unresolved issues and exposing the fractures that had been quietly growing between them. One evening, Mark came home from work to find Jessica in the kitchen, preparing dinner, a rare occurrence since her demanding job often kept her away from the stove. She was chopping vegetables, her face set with concentration, and for a moment, Mark was reminded of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Smells good, he said, setting his bag down. Jessica looked up and offered a tentative smile. I thought we could have a nice dinner together. Just us. Mark nodded, appreciating the gesture but unsure if it would erase the ache in his chest. Still, he sat at the table as Jessica set down plates of pasta and salad, the simplicity of the meal somehow amplifying the quiet intimacy of the moment. They really talked, for the first time in weeks. Jessica shared memories of their early days, stories that made Mark smile despite himself. For a brief moment, it felt like they were finding their way back to each other. But just as the evening began to feel light again, Mark's phone buzzed on the table. Jessica glanced at it, her heart sinking as she noticed the name flashing on the screen. Daniel. Mark's expression darkened. He grabbed the phone and silenced it, but the damage was done. The name lingered in the air between them like a ghost. Why is he calling you? Mark asked, his voice calm but laced with accusation. Jessica's stomach churned. I don't know. I haven't spoken to him since I ended things. I swear. Mark's eyes bore into hers, searching for any hint of dishonesty. If that's true, then why would he be calling now? Jess, if there's something you're not telling me. I'm not lying, Mark. Jessica's voice cracked, her frustration bubbling over. I've done everything I can to prove I'm committed to fixing this. I can't control what Daniel does. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. It's hard to believe that when his name keeps coming up. Every time I think I can trust you again, something happens to remind me why I can't. Jessica's shoulders slumped, the weight of his words crushing her resolve. I don't know what else to do. I can't change the past, Mark. All I can do is try to move forward. Mark stared at her, his expression softening slightly. Then let's figure out why he's still in our lives. Together. The next day, Jessica sent Daniel a message, demanding an explanation. His response came quickly. I just wanted to check on you, see if you're okay. I miss you. Jessica showed the message to Mark, her hands trembling. I didn't respond. I won't respond. Mark nodded, though his jaw tightened at the confirmation that Daniel hadn't let go. Block his number, he said firmly. If he can't respect your boundaries, he doesn't deserve access to you. Jessica hesitated for only a moment before deleting Daniel's contact and blocking his number. The act felt like closing a door on a chapter of her life she wished she could erase. But Daniel wasn't ready to let go that easily. A week later, Jessica received an email at work. The subject line read, "One last chance." She opened it hesitantly, her stomach twisting in knots. "Jessica, I know you're trying to make things work with Mark, but can you honestly say you're happy? Can you look me in the eye and tell me that you don't feel anything for me? If you can, I'll leave you alone. But if there's even a part of you that still cares, meet me at the park where we first talked. Tonight at 7. I'll wait for you." Jessica stared at the screen, her mind racing. She knew what she had to do, but the temptation to see Daniel one last time lingered like an unwelcome guest. That evening, she told Mark about the email. His reaction was immediate. "You're not going," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jessica shook her head. "I wasn't planning to, but I think I need to tell him to his face that this is over." Completely. Mark's jaw clenched, his anger barely contained. "Why do you owe him that? He's trying to manipulate you, Jess. Don't give him the satisfaction." Jessica placed a hand on his arm, her voice steady. "Because I need to end this my way. For both of us." Jessica arrived at the park just before 7, the sun dipping low on the horizon. She spotted Daniel sitting on a bench near the fountain, his confident demeanor dimmed by an air of sadness. When he saw her, he stood, his face lighting up. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Jessica crossed her arms, keeping a safe distance. "I came to tell you that this needs to stop. I've blocked your number. I'm trying to rebuild my life with Mark, and you're making that impossible." Daniel's smile faltered, replaced by a look of desperation. "Jessica, I know you think you can fix things, but you're lying to yourself. We had something real, something you'll never have with him." Jessica shook her head, her voice firm. "What we had wasn't real, Daniel. It was an escape, a fantasy. But it's not my reality, and it never will be." Daniel's eyes filled with frustration. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe I am," Jessica said, her voice softening. "But it's my mistake to make. Goodbye, Daniel." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. When she returned home, she found Mark waiting for her on the porch. Without a word, she sat beside him, her presence enough to convey what he needed to know. The confrontation with Daniel marked a turning point. Slowly, the walls between Jessica and Mark began to come down. They started spending more time together as a family, taking Lily to the park or playing board games after dinner. The laughter that had once been absent from their home gradually returned. But rebuilding trust was a slow and painful process. Mark still struggled with moments of doubt, and Jessica often found herself second-guessing her every action, desperate to prove her commitment. Their therapist suggested they renew their vows, a symbolic gesture to reaffirm their love and dedication to each other. Though hesitant at first, both Jessica and Mark agreed. The ceremony was small, held in their backyard with only a few close friends and family in attendance. As Jessica stood across from Mark, the weight of everything they had endured settled over her. But instead of crushing her, it made her feel stronger. She had nearly lost everything, but standing there, hand in hand with the man she had loved for over a decade, she knew they had a chance to create something new. When Mark spoke his vows, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, but I promise to keep fighting for us, to be better, to never take you for granted again." Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she replied, "And I promise to be honest, to be present, and to never stop trying to earn back your trust. I love you, Mark." The renewed commitment didn't erase the past, but it gave them a foundation to build on. Over time, the scars of betrayal began to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding of each other's needs and vulnerabilities. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in years, that was enough. The weeks following their vow renewal were far from smooth. Jessica and Mark were committed to rebuilding their marriage, but the aftermath of betrayal had left deep scars. Every day was a test of their patience, trust, and determination to move forward. Though they had made progress, there were still moments when the weight of their past choices threatened to drag them under. One evening, Mark came home visibly tense. Jessica noticed immediately. She set down the book she was reading and met him in the kitchen. "Rough day?" she asked gently, pouring him a glass of water. Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. A guy at work asked me how I managed to forgive and forget." He let out a bitter laugh. "I didn't even know how to respond." Jessica's heart sank. She had been so focused on her own guilt and efforts to make amends that she sometimes forgot how much Mark was still struggling. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft. "I know this isn't easy for you. For us." Mark looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I'm trying, Jess. I really am. But some days, it's just hard to let go." Jessica stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "I don't expect you to forget, and I don't expect this to get better overnight. But I hope you'll keep fighting with me." Mark nodded, though his eyes held a flicker of doubt. "I'm not giving up, but I need you to understand that it's going to take time." Jessica nodded, her chest tight. She knew this was their reality now. Two people trying to heal while carrying the burden of their shared pain. The turning point came on a stormy Friday evening. Mark had just gotten home from work when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face instantly hardening. "What is it?" Jessica asked, noticing his change in demeanor. "It's Daniel," Mark said, holding up his phone to show the text message. It read, "I need to talk to Jessica. It's important." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She had blocked Daniel's number, but it seemed he had found another way to reach out. "I don't know what he could possibly want," she said, her voice shaking. "I told him it was over." Mark's jaw tightened. He doesn't seem to get the message. Maybe I should remind him. "Mark, please don't do anything rash," Jessica said quickly. "I'll handle it." Mark shook his head. "No, Jess, this isn't just your problem anymore. It's ours." Against her better judgment, Jessica agreed to let Mark confront Daniel. They decided to meet him the following morning at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. The air between them was thick with tension as they prepared for the encounter, both unsure of what Daniel's intentions were. The next morning, they arrived at the coffee shop early. Jessica's nerves were on edge as they waited, her fingers tapping restlessly on the table. Mark sat beside her, his expression stoic but his clenched fists betraying his unease. When Daniel walked in, he immediately spotted them and approached with a confident stride. He looked composed, but there was an intensity in his eyes that put Jessica on edge. "Jessica." "Mark," Daniel said, nodding politely as he took a seat across from them. "Thank you for meeting me." Mark didn't waste any time. "What do you want, Daniel? Haven't you done enough?" Daniel raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just needed to say my piece." Jessica folded her arms, her voice firm. "You already said everything you needed to. I told you it's over. There's nothing left to talk about." Daniel leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "You may think it's over, but it's not. You're settling, Jessica. You're trying to patch up something that's broken beyond repair, and deep down, you know it." Mark's expression darkened, his fists tightening on the table. "You don't get to decide what's broken or not. We're working on our marriage, and it's none of your business." Daniel smirked, his eyes flicking to Mark. "You think you're the hero here, but you're just the guy she settled for. You'll never be enough for her." The tension at the table exploded. Mark stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You need to leave. Now." Jessica grabbed Mark's arm, trying to calm him. "Mark, don't. He's not worth it." Daniel stood as well, clearly unfazed. "I'll leave. But just remember, Jessica, you can only lie to yourself for so long." As Daniel walked out, Mark's shoulders sagged, the adrenaline draining from him. Jessica felt a wave of relief that the confrontation hadn't escalated further. but she could see the hurt and anger etched into Mark's face. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I never should have let him get this close to us." Mark shook his head. "It's not your fault he can't let go. But if he ever contacts you again, we're taking legal action. I'm done letting him interfere in our lives." Jessica nodded, her resolve strengthening. She was done letting Daniel linger in the shadows of her marriage. The encounter with Daniel seemed to serve as a catalyst for Jessica and Mark. It reminded them of what they were fighting for and what they stood to lose. They threw themselves into their therapy sessions with renewed determination, addressing the lingering doubts and fears that had been holding them back. For Mark, it was about learning to trust Jessica again, to believe that she was committed to their marriage. For Jessica, it was about proving her love and dedication, not just through words but through actions. One evening, after putting Lily to bed, they sat on the couch together, a quiet moment of connection that had become increasingly rare. Mark reached for Jessica's hand, his touch hesitant but warm. "I know I've been holding on to a lot of anger," he said, "and I know it's been hard on you, but I want you to know, I do see how hard you're trying, and I appreciate it." Jessica squeezed his hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm not giving up, Mark. Not on you. Not on us." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step forward, one that felt more solid than anything they had built in months. Life slowly began to return to normal, though the experience had changed them both. They learned to communicate more openly, to address issues before they festered. There were still difficult days, but they faced them together, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured. For Jessica, the journey had been a painful lesson in the consequences of her actions. She had nearly lost everything, but in the process, she had rediscovered what truly mattered. For Mark, it was a reminder that love wasn't about perfection. It was about resilience, forgiveness, and the willingness to keep trying, even when it hurt. As they sat together one evening, watching Lily play in the yard, Jessica leaned her head against Mark's shoulder. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, they both felt hope. The confrontation with Daniel seemed to mark a turning point, but the challenges for Jessica and Mark were far from over. Though they had recommitted to rebuilding their marriage, the scars of betrayal ran deep. For Mark, the hardest part wasn't just forgiving Jessica. It was silencing the doubts that still crept into his mind during quiet moments. And for Jessica, every step forward felt fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter everything they were trying to rebuild. One evening, while they were putting Lily to bed, she innocently asked a question that stopped them both in their tracks. "Are you and Daddy still mad at each other?" Jessica's throat tightened, and she exchanged a quick glance with Mark. "Why do you ask that, sweetie?" she asked softly. Lily shrugged, clutching her stuffed bunny. "You don't laugh as much anymore, and sometimes it feels different." Mark crouched beside her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Mommy and I love each other very much, and we love you more than anything. We've just had some hard days, but we're working through them. Okay?" Lily nodded, her innocent acceptance both comforting and heartbreaking. Jessica kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering a promise to herself that she wouldn't let her family down again. After Lily fell asleep, Mark and Jessica sat together in the living room. The weight of Lily's words hung heavily in the air. "She sees more than we realize," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, staring at his hands. "Kids always do, and she deserves better." Jessica placed a hand on his arm, her touch tentative. "So do you." Mark looked at her, his expression softening. "So do we. But we're not going to get there unless we let go of the past." Jessica's heart clenched. "I want to. I'm trying." "I know," Mark said, his voice steady. "And so am I. But maybe it's time we stop trying to do this alone." The suggestion to involve a marriage counselor was a turning point. While therapy had been helpful, they needed a new perspective. Someone who could help them navigate the lingering tension and unresolved pain. They found a highly recommended counselor named Dr. Grace Caldwell, whose no-nonsense approach was exactly what they needed. During their first session, Dr. Caldwell wasted no time addressing the elephant in the room. "Jessica, You made a choice that hurt your husband deeply, she said bluntly. And Mark, you're holding on to that hurt like a shield. If you two can't find a way to meet in the middle, this marriage won't survive. The honesty was brutal, but it was exactly what they needed to hear. As the weeks went by, their sessions with Dr. Caldwell forced them to confront the deeper issues in their marriage. Jessica admitted that her emotional affair with Daniel had been a symptom of a larger problem: her feelings of invisibility and disconnection. Mark, in turn, acknowledged that his focus on work had often left Jessica feeling isolated and unappreciated. It was painful, but it was progress. One particularly intense session brought everything to a head. Dr. Caldwell asked Mark a question that had been lingering in the back of his mind since the day he discovered Jessica's betrayal. Do you believe she loves you, Mark? Truly loves you? Mark hesitated, the silence stretching painfully long. Jessica's heart pounded as she waited for his answer. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice raw. I do. But sometimes I wonder if I'm enough for her. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. You are, Mark. You always have been. I lost sight of that. And I hate that I made you doubt it. Dr. Caldwell leaned forward, her tone firm but empathetic. Trust takes time to rebuild, Mark. But you need to decide whether you're willing to believe in Jessica's love again, or if you're going to let this doubt define your relationship. Mark nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words was settling into place. I want to believe. I really do. The breakthrough in counseling was followed by a quiet evening at home that felt like a small victory. They cooked dinner together, a simple meal of pasta and salad, but it was the laughter they shared while trying to open a stubborn jar of marinara sauce that made the night memorable. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were simply enjoying each other's company. Later that night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Mark reached for Jessica's hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Jessica leaned her head on his shoulder, a flicker of hope lighting up her heart. But life had one final test in store for them. A few weeks later, Jessica received an unexpected call from her office. One of her colleagues, unaware of the turmoil she had been through, casually mentioned that Daniel had reached out to inquire about an event she was planning. Jessica's chest tightened. She had made it clear to Daniel that their relationship was over, but his persistence was unnerving. She immediately called Mark to tell him what had happened. He's still trying to contact you? Mark said, his voice laced with frustration. This has to stop, Jess. We can't keep moving forward with him lurking in the background. Jessica agreed, and together they decided to take legal action. With the help of an attorney, they filed a restraining order against Daniel, citing his repeated attempts to contact Jessica despite her clear boundaries. When the paperwork was finalized, Jessica felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It's over, she said to Mark, her voice filled with relief. Mark pulled her into a hug, his arms strong and reassuring. It is, and now we can finally focus on us. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet moments of healing. Jessica and Mark continued their counseling sessions, but more importantly, they began to rebuild their lives outside of therapy. They planned a weekend getaway, a chance to reconnect away from the stress and memories that had clouded their home. On the last night of their trip, they sat on the balcony of their hotel room, overlooking the ocean. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was soothing, a reminder of the resilience of nature and, perhaps, their own. Jessica reached for Mark's hand, her voice soft but steady. I know I've said this before, but thank you for staying, for fighting for us. Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and vulnerability. You're worth fighting for, Jess. We're worth fighting for. As they sat there, the sun dipping below the horizon, they both felt a sense of peace that had eluded them for so long. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. The months following the restraining order against Daniel marked a turning point in Jessica and Mark's marriage. The looming shadow of his interference was gone, leaving them free to focus entirely on each other. It wasn't an overnight fix. The wounds they had endured needed time to heal, but the progress they made together was undeniable. Jessica began to see Mark with new eyes. She appreciated the quiet strength he had shown throughout their ordeal, the patience it took for him to stand by her even when his trust was shaken. And for Mark, the walls of resentment and doubt he had built around himself started to crumble as Jessica proved, time and again, her commitment to their family. One evening, as they sat in their backyard watching Lily chase fireflies, Mark turned to Jessica with a rare, unguarded smile. "Do you remember when we first moved here?" he asked. Jessica nodded, her face softening at the memory. "You insisted on planting that garden over there," she said, pointing to a small patch of flowers. "I told you nothing would grow because the soil was too rocky." Mark chuckled. "And you were right. Nothing did. But I kept planting, hoping one day something would take root." Jessica leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think something did." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past few months melting away in the warmth of the moment. Their marriage wasn't just surviving, it was thriving in ways neither of them had thought possible. They continued to see Dr. Caldwell, not because their relationship was in trouble, but because they found value in the open communication it fostered. Therapy became less about healing old wounds and more about learning how to grow together. Jessica also made changes in her professional life. She stepped back from some of her more demanding clients, opting instead to focus on projects that allowed her to spend more time with her family. She realized that her drive to succeed had been a way to fill a void, one she no longer felt now that her relationships were stronger. Mark, too, found balance. He started coming home earlier from work, setting boundaries with his job so he could be more present at home. He discovered that being there for Jessica and Lily brought him more fulfillment than any project or promotion ever could. One Saturday, Jessica and Mark decided to take Lily to the park for a family picnic. As they spread out their blanket under the shade of a large oak tree, Jessica couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. They had weathered a storm that could have torn them apart, and yet here they were, stronger than ever. As Lily ran off to play on the swings, Jessica turned to Mark. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't made it through?" Mark considered her question for a moment. "Sometimes, but I think those thoughts only remind me how lucky we are. Not everyone gets a second chance." Jessica smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "I'm just glad we took it." Their journey wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of doubt and insecurity, but those moments were fewer and far between. They had learned how to lean on each other, to communicate openly, and to prioritize their relationship in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. As the months turned into years, the scars of their past became less visible, replaced by a love that was deeper, more resilient. They celebrated milestones together. Lily's first day of middle school, Jessica landing a dream client, Mark receiving recognition at work, and each moment felt like a victory. In the final scene of their story, Jessica and Mark stood in their kitchen, preparing dinner together. It was a simple, ordinary evening, but it was in these small, quiet moments that the strength of their bond truly showed. Lily burst into the room, holding up a school project she had just finished. "Look, Mom, Dad, I made a family tree." Jessica and Mark leaned over the poster, smiling at the colorful branches Lily had drawn. At the center was a heart, surrounded by pictures of the three of them. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Jessica said, her voice full of warmth. Mark ruffled Lily's hair. "You're pretty amazing, you know that?" Lily beamed, her laughter filling the room. As Jessica looked at her family, she felt a wave of peace. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They had fought for each other, for their love, and for the future they wanted to build. And as they stood there together, she knew they had won. Thank you for following this journey with us. Stories like this remind us of the power of resilience, forgiveness, and the strength of love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt tales. And let us know in the comments, what would you do in their shoes? See you in the next video.